A loud crash broke the stillness of the evening, sending a jolt through the house. The father's brow furrowed as he stepped inside, his eyes landing on a chair lying on its side. His son stood nearby, his small frame trembling, his fists clenched tightly. His voice, usually soft and filled with warmth, now carried a sharp edge as he let out a frustrated shout. His face was flushed, his emotions spilling out in a way the father hadn't seen before. The father sighed, his expression hardening. He muttered under his breath about children being dramatic, brushing the moment aside as a fleeting tantrum. He told himself he'd address it later when the boy had calmed down, his thoughts already shifting back to the long day of work he had left behind. In the days that followed, the boy's world grew quieter. He sat alone, his small hands resting on the edge of a blank page. His crayons lay untouched beside him, their bright colors a sharp contrast to the somber air around him. His laughter, once a melody that filled the house, faded into silence. He stared at the empty page for hours, his eyes distant, his thoughts heavy. The drawings he once shared with pride began to change. The playful figures that danced across the pages were gone, replaced by shadowed forms and hollow faces. The joy that once lived in his sketches had disappeared, replaced by something darker, something the father didn't notice. His mind was too full of deadlines and responsibilities to see the quiet cries for help that were taking shape in his son's world. One morning, the mother stumbled upon a small, crumpled piece of paper while tidying the boy's room. She smoothed it out with gentle hands, her breath catching as her eyes fell on the uneven letters scribbled across it. "I feel invisible," the words read, heavy with sadness. Her heart tightened, the weight of those words sinking deep. She hurried to show the father, her voice trembling with worry as she held the note out to him. He glanced at it briefly, his face unreadable. He waved it off with a shrug, his tone dismissive. "Children exaggerate," he said, "their emotions always larger than life." There was no need to worry, no reason to overthink. The mother's protest was quiet, her words trailing off as the father turned away, his mind once again tethered to his work. From his room, the boy listened. His small hands pressed against the doorframe, his breath shallow as he strained to catch every word. His chest ached with every dismissive phrase, the weight in his heart growing heavier. He bit his lip, his eyes stinging as a single tear slid down his cheek. The ache of being unheard, of feeling invisible, wrapped around him like a shadow. In the quiet of his room, the boy sat alone once more. His crayons remained untouched, the blank page before him mirroring the emptiness he felt inside. The note, now smoothed and read, carried the weight of his unspoken pain, a silent plea that had gone unanswered. The rhythmic clang of the hammer filled the air, a steady song that carried through the village. Each strike against the metal was precise, shaping it into tools that would feed families, treasures that would adorn homes. Neighbors paused to listen, their voices filled with praise for the man who worked so tirelessly. They called him the backbone of the village, a provider whose hands, roughened by years of labor, carried the weight of their trust. Each evening, he wiped the sweat from his brow, his shoulders heavy with the burden of responsibility. His thoughts lingered on the needs of his family, the demands of his work, and the endless race to shield them from the hardships of life. He muttered to himself about the need to push harder, to do more, his focus never shifting from the anvil before him. Beyond the forge, a boy's laughter rippled through the village, bright and carefree. His small legs darted between paths as he chased the birds that scattered in his wake. His voice carried stories of great journeys, weaving tales of magical rivers and golden mountains. Villagers smiled as he passed, charmed by his vivid imagination and wide, toothy grin. To them, he was a spark of joy, a reminder of life's simple wonders. In the evenings, the boy waited by the door, his wooden toy clutched tightly in his hands. His fingers ran over the carvings he had made, eager to share them with his father. He pictured the smile that would greet him, the proud words that would make his heart swell. When the father finally arrived, his face lined with exhaustion. The boy ran forward, his eyes bright with anticipation. He held the toy out, his voice filled with excitement as he shared the story behind it. But the father's gaze was distant, his steps slow. He nodded absently, his mind already consumed by the next day's work. The boy's smile faltered, but he hid it quickly, his hands lowering the toy as he turned away. The nights grew longer. The father's returns more weary. Each step seemed heavier, each sigh deeper, as his focus remained locked on his responsibilities. The boy sat by the window, his wooden toy forgotten beside him. His laughter, once so bright, faded into quiet sighs. He filled the silence with drawings, his small hands tracing scenes of adventures he had dreamed of sharing. But the pages filled with figures standing alone, their faces tilted toward the horizon, waiting for something that never came. The mother watched silently, her heart heavy with the weight of her son's growing quiet. She saw the spark in his eyes dimming, replaced by a shadow that crept in slowly, unnoticed by the father. She wanted to speak, to bridge the growing gap, but each time she opened her mouth, the sight of her husband's hunched shoulders and tired eyes silenced her. She feared her words would only add to his burden. The boy spent his days beneath the old baobab tree, his fingers tracing shapes in the dirt. Other children played nearby, their laughter filling the air, but he stayed apart, his drawings a quiet escape. His sketches began to change, the joyful lines replaced with solitary figures and empty landscapes. The father dismissed the shift, his mind too full to see it for what it was. Children grow up, he thought. Their worlds change. It was nothing to worry about. The mother folded her hands, her prayers soft but steady. She prayed for her family. For the boy who waited too often, for the father who carried so much. She prayed that the silent gap between them would not grow wider, that it could be bridged before it was too late. And in the quiet of their home, as the boy's hands moved across the page, her whispers rose into the stillness. The teacher stood at the door, her voice steady yet laced with worry. She spoke of the boy's empty gaze, how his eyes seemed lost during lessons. She described unfinished homework, forgotten on his desk, and the way his laughter no longer filled the playground. She mentioned his withdrawal, the quiet distance he kept from his friends, and the way he sat alone, staring at nothing. The father listened, nodding as her words drifted past him. His gaze wandered to the tools on the table, his hands itching to get back to work. He promised to speak to his son, his words polite but empty, a hollow assurance wrapped in good intentions. He spoke of long hours and heavy burdens, brushing off the weight of her concern. The teacher sighed softly, her eyes filled with unspoken please, but she left without further protest. The boy wandered further from home, drawn to the laughter of an older boy whose reputation preceded him. Known for his daring stunts and endless mischief, the older boy's confidence was magnetic. He introduced the boy to games that tested bravery, dares that sent adrenaline rushing through his veins. The boy laughed with him, his excitement masking the hollow ache inside. A day after day, the boy returned home with scuffed knees and clothes torn at the edges. His words were vague, excuses muttered under his breath as he avoided his mother's gaze. Her heart sank as she watched him retreat further into himself, the bright light in his eyes growing dim. She spoke gently, but his answers were brief, his shoulders shrugging off her concern. The mother's voice trembled as she sat across from the father, her words heavy with worry. She described the boy's late nights, the empty drawings abandoned on his desk, and the quiet sadness that lingered in his gaze. Her hands clutched the edge of her seat, her heart aching as she begged the father to see what she saw. But his response was sharp and dismissive, insisting that children go through phases and that work was his priority. Her frustration boiled beneath the surface as she pressed him further, her words pleading for him to notice. She pointed to the small changes, the signs that something was slipping away. But his tone ended the conversation, his focus firmly rooted in his responsibilities. She sat in silence, her eyes filled with a quiet pain that he failed to see. The older boy's laughter echoed through the air, sharp and mocking. He held a token in his hand, dangling it high as he dared the boy to climb the rickety tree and retrieve it. His words dripped with challenge, his tone filled with the promise of approval if the boy succeeded. The boy hesitated, his small hands trembling as he gripped the tree's rough trunk. He glanced at the branches above, thin and unsteady, swaying slightly in the breeze. Fear tightened in his chest, but the older boy's laughter pushed him forward. He couldn't back down, not now. The need to prove himself outweighed the warnings echoing in his mind. Step by step, he climbed higher, his heart pounding louder with each movement. His hands gripped the branches, his fingers pressing against the bark as the ground grew further away. The older boy shouted encouragement from below, his voice filled with mock cheer. The boy's breath quickened, his determination masking the danger that loomed with every step. The father's hands shook as the healer's words struck like a hammer. His heart dropped at the mention of his son, the urgency in the healer's tone wrapping his chest in cold dread. He didn't wait to hear more. His legs moved before his mind could catch up, carrying him through the village as his breath came in short, panicked bursts. Faces blurred past him, their expressions a mix of concern and pity. The air around him felt heavy, but not as heavy as the fear clouding his mind. When he reached the gathering, his heart stopped. His son lay still on the ground, bruises marking his small body. His face was pale, his chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. Villagers stood in a circle, their voices hushed, recounting the accident with words laced with worry. The boy had fallen, they said. The tree had been too thin, the branches too weak to hold him. Their voices merged into a murmur, but the father couldn't focus on anything except the still figure before him. A sharp pang of guilt twisted in his chest, threatening to drown him. The mother stood beside him, her eyes brimming with tears that spilled freely down her face. Her voice broke through his daze, trembling yet filled with anger and sorrow. She recounted her warnings, each word a sharp reminder of what he had chosen to ignore. She spoke of the boy's distance, his sadness, the changes that were so obvious, yet dismissed. Her voice rose, her emotions spilling over as she reminded him of the quiet pleas she had made. Her words pierced him deeper than the whispers of the villagers. The teacher stepped forward, her tone solemn. She spoke of the boy's troubling friendship with the older boy, her earlier concerns now unfolding into a grim reality. She described the boy's loneliness, his need for approval, and how it had driven him to take dangerous risks. Each revelation pressed down on the father like a boulder, the weight of his regret growing heavier with every passing second. He stood there, his chest tight, his mind flooded with all the signs he had ignored to be by his son's bedside. The father sat in silence. His fingers brushed against the boy's small hand, the warmth barely enough to reassure him. Memories surged through his mind like an unrelenting tide, moments he had missed, laughter he had dismissed, and the quiet calls for attention he had turned away from. His eyes stung as he thought of the times he chose work over his family. Telling himself it was for their future while their present slipped away. The boy stirred slightly, his voice weak but clear. His words hit the father like a spear. I just wanted you to see me. They hung in the air, echoing louder than any shout. The father's chest heaved as tears streamed down his face. The ache in his heart became unbearable as he realized the depth of his son's pain, a pain he had unknowingly caused. He gripped the boy's hand tighter, his silent tears falling onto the sheets. His voice broke as he spoke, each word heavy with sorrow. He apologized, his tone raw with emotion. He promised to be present, to cherish the moments he had once taken for granted. He swore never to let his work overshadow the people who mattered most. His words were not just a plea for forgiveness, but a vow to change, to be the father his son needed. The boy's small fingers curled around his father's hand, a quiet but powerful gesture of forgiveness. The father's heart swelled as he saw the faintest hint of a smile on the boy's face. In that moment, the bond between them began to mend, the cracks slowly filling with love and resolve. The father knew the journey ahead would not be easy, but he was ready to put his son first, to rebuild the trust that had been broken. Together, they took the first step toward healing, their connection strengthened by the lessons learned and the promise of a better tomorrow. The father stepped into the house earlier than he had in years. His son turned, eyes wide with surprise, unsure what to expect. But there was no scolding, no hurried excuses. Instead, the father's face softened into a warm smile. He knelt beside his son, asking about his day with genuine interest. The boy hesitated, then spoke, his voice cautious at first, but the father listened with care. Every word was met with a nod, a laugh, or a question that made the boy feel heard for the first time in what felt like forever. That evening, the father pulled out a board game from a dusty corner. Together, they played, the boy's timid laughter growing louder with each turn. When the game ended, the father reached for a pencil, handing it to his son. They began to draw, their heads bent close as they shared a piece of paper. The boy's lines were bold and imaginative, while the father's were shaky and unsure, but they laughed together as the picture came to life. Slowly, the boy's wounded spirit began to heal, his laughter filling the house with warmth that had long been missing. The boy's drawings, once somber and lonely, now showed bright fields and smiling faces. His joy returned, cautious at first, but soon unrestrained. The father marveled at how easily the boy's laughter spread, warming every corner of the home. For the first time in a long while, the boy slept with a peaceful smile, his heart lighter than it had been in months. One day, the father stood in the village square, his voice steady but laced with emotion. He shared his story, his mistakes, and the lessons they had taught him. Parents gathered around, their expressions shifting from curiosity to understanding as his words sank in. He spoke of his son's quiet cries for attention, of the near loss that had opened his eyes. He urged them to cherish their children, to see them, hear them, and hold them close before it was too late. The teacher stepped forward, pride shining in her eyes as she spoke of the boy's progress. She praised the family's renewed effort, their determination to lift their son back to his bright, lively self. The villagers listened, their glances full of shared understanding. Each one left the square with a silent promise to ensure no child in their care would ever feel invisible. At home, the family's days took on a new rhythm. Meals were shared together, each one filled with laughter and stories. Nights were spent under the stars, the father weaving tales that made the boy's eyes widen with wonder. The boy's confidence returned, shining brighter than ever before. He spoke with certainty, his smile reaching his eyes as he darted around the yard, his imagination alive once more. The father watched his son, marveling at the resilience that had brought him back from the edge. Pride swelled in his chest, not for himself, but for the boy who had endured so much. The mother's gentle smile reflected the peace that had settled in their home, a peace built on love, attention, and understanding. In the quiet of the night, the father made a silent vow. Never again would he let work overshadow the moments that truly mattered. His family would always come first. The echo of his son's laughter and the warmth of his wife's smile reminded him of what he had almost lost. Together, they moved forward, their bond unshakable, their love a guiding light through every challenge ahead. A child's heart is a delicate flame, flickering with hope and trust. It burns brightly when nurtured, each moment of care feeding its light. A smile, a kind word, a shared laugh, these small gestures are the fuel that keeps the flame alive. The bond between a parent and their child grows stronger with every moment of attention, every act of love. The flame shines, warm and steady, illuminating the path of growth and happiness, but neglect is a shadow, creeping silently, dimming the brightness of that flame. When a child's voice goes unheard, their laughter unacknowledged, the light begins to fade. The emptiness left behind is heavy, marked by silence and sorrow. The price of neglect is not paid in a single moment but in the quiet erosion of trust and joy. Missed glances, ignored whispers, forgotten promises, they carve wounds that grow deeper with time. The shadow lingers, leaving behind a regret that no amount of work or success can erase. The narrator's tone sharpens, filled with urgency. Parents must pause, they must look beyond their tasks and responsibilities. The smallest glance, the simplest words, have the power to anchor a child's world. To a child, their parents are the sun, the moon, the stars. Their world begins and ends with the love and attention they receive. The narrator's voice rises, a plea to be the light that guides, to shield the small flame from the winds of neglect. The reflection ends with a powerful call. See the child. Hear their laughter, their silences, their stories. Protect the bond that binds hearts together. Nurture the flame, so it burns bright and steady, ensuring no child feels unseen, unheard, or forgotten.